Welcome back to The Shed. Today we're going to take a look at the 1961 Hugo award-winning novel by Walter M Miller Jr., A Canticle for Leibowitz. So what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll put it to the memory test, we'll make some recommendations, and I'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder where I've been ranking all these wonderful novels. So this is a fixed-up novel, and it's made up of 3 short stories. The first one being Fiat Homo, followed by Fiat Lux, and followed ultimately by Fiat Voluntas Tua. Now, it wasn't until the third short story that Walter realized he's got a novel going on here, and he later released A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is one of my all-time favorite novels. So we learned that in the 20th century there was an engineer, a Jewish engineer called Leibowitz, and he's on the run, and the reason that is because he's just survived the Flame Deluge War, this huge atomic war, atomic holocaust that's pretty much decimated the planet. And he's on the run because civilians have rebelled against all knowledge. They sort of see knowledge as ultimately resulting something as terrible as this atomic holocaust event that they've all suffered through. So they want no longer any part of it. So they've gone out to literally kill any scientist or any profession, anyone who had any kind of knowledge. So Leibowitz finds sanctuary in a monastery and with time becomes a monk himself. And he convinces the others to start a new order in order to preserve knowledge, hence the Albertian order of Leibowitz. So in the first part, we bounce back to the year the 26th century, and it tells the story of young Francis, brother Francis, who's on a pilgrimage of sorts, and he stumbles across this Jewish wanderer, and they have a bit of an interesting exchange, and Francis later finds this old tomb, this underground cavern, that holds what appears to be a whole lot of articles written by none other than Leibowitz, and these happen to be engineering blueprints, things like shopping lists, and other memorabilia. And this all happens during the canonization process of Leibowitz. So the order of Leibowitz, they sort of want to make their founding father a saint, so they're going through the canonization process. So in the first part, we really learn about what happened in the 20th century with the Holocaust. We learn about the 26th century and Brother Francis and what may ultimately happen with Leibowitz and his canonization process. So in the second part, the year is 3174, and we find the monks are still holding and preserving all this wonderful knowledge, but we're at the era of a new renaissance. So we find that the secular world is also making scientific discoveries, as is the church, but they've sort of taken different tangents. And ultimately, the two come together and clash. So the church is now faced with state versus church, and what do we do with this knowledge? How do we help preserve knowledge? And what do we need to ultimately do to combine our knowledge in these areas to give humanity hope? In the third part, Fiat Voluntas Tua, the year is 3781, and man has nuclear energy and weapons again, and we find that the order of St. Leibowitz is now been expanded to preserve all knowledge. And what we have is 2 warring parties that make up the majority of the Earth's power. And they've been testing these atomic weapons against all rules and laws and legislation. So they've been testing these atomic weapons, and a nuclear event, a nuclear accident escalates things into a pretty doom and gloom, sort of 1 minute to midnight sort of scenario. So as a contingency plan, we find that the monks in the order of St. Leibowitz have been working on a contingency plan to ensure the survival of knowledge through the ages, even in an imminent threat of mutual assured destruction. So the story is, will man ever learn from their past mistakes? What hope is there in the future? And what part will the church, in an order like St. Leibowitz here, do to preserve knowledge for all generations? So look, this is one of my all-time favorite novels, and I absolutely loved it. So what is it that I liked? Look, I really like the post-apocalyptic themes in this novel. I like the way that, Miller's got these monks preserving these ancient artifacts, and sometimes they're so mistaken, like with things like shopping lists and blueprints, as to their actual meaning and what they're supposed to represent. And I just love that concept. I remember as a kid having very similar ideas, thinking, what if it was someone, in a post-apocalyptic Earth was to find my 30-centimeter school ruler? What would they make of something like that? So it took me right back to childhood, having those thoughts, and I thought it was just really nicely done. which I think is really testament to the other thing that I really enjoyed in this novel, which is Walter M Miller Jr.'s writing. I think Walter was just a wonderful writer, and I really liked the way that he's portrayed this very mysterious, very bizarre future Earth, which is also very recognizable. So automatically, you sort of, as a monks are looking at these artifacts, you think, oh, that seems to be a blueprint, or this seems to be a shopping list or a computer printout of sorts. So he's making it so mysterious, but on the other hand, so recognizable, that I thought were just really testament to just how wonderful the writing in this novel is. I also really like the way that Walter M, in this very bleak and what appears to be hopeless scenario, by the use of his language and wonderful narration, just also gives hope. And there's also a fair bit of dark humor in there. Like, I don't think it'll have you chuckling out loud, but there's definitely references of dark humor in this one as well that I thoroughly enjoyed. The other thing I really enjoyed are the religious themes in this novel. I've mentioned it several times in the past. I really like my science fiction with those religious themes thrown in. And this, for me, is probably one of the best when it comes to religious themed novels in science fiction, because I think it strikes that really good balance. Now, there's a lot of Latin in here that I really like, which is really different, really stark contrast to what we find in the short stories. So it wasn't until the novel, the three stories became a novel, that we see the introduction of a lot more Latin. So if you're familiar with the Catholic faith, you'll see there's a lot of reference to the Latin sermons that they and rituals they hold. So there's a lot of Latin in here, which I think makes it just for wonderful reading experience. At least it did for me. The other thing I enjoyed was the way that Walter M really addressed difficult themes like the problem with pain, euthanasia, and if there's a good and loving God, how and why would he allow pain and sin like this? So I think he tackled those areas very well. It didn't get too philosophical, it didn't get too preachy, but those subjects were definitely brought up in the book. And I thought what was really interesting is that there's never... it's a difficult question to ask, and I think Walter M Miller Jr. played both sides fairly evenly and showed the torment and struggle on both sides, right? It's never, no matter what conviction you have, it's always difficult subject to answer. And I think Walter M Miller Jr. really did it wonderfully in this piece of novel. So what's there not to like in this wonderful novel by Walter M Miller Jr.? I'd have to say, look, for me, absolutely nothing. This is one of my all-time favorite novels. It has been ever since the very first time I read it, and I really can't put a fault to it. But I'll put some caveats around that. There is a fair bit of Latin in this novel, and not that I'm a Latin professor, but I'm from an Italian background in a heritage, so I can understand a lot of the Latin phrases and what they actually mean. So that for me wasn't a hindrance. I quite enjoyed, and as I talked to in my likes area, I quite enjoyed those Latin passages, but it can get a bit heavier, and I can see some people being put off by the Latin in this novel. There's a fair chunky bit to it. The other thing I would say is that it is very Catholic faith biased, this novel. So there's a lot of liturgy about the Catholic Church, which may turn some viewers off. It didn't personally me. I enjoyed that aspect of it as well. But there is a fair bit of Catholicism in this novel that may deter some readers as well. So look, it didn't do that for me, but I just thought I'd put it out there so you can make your own choices when coming to read this wonderful novel, which I still thoroughly recommend. And when it comes to the memory test, A Canticle for Leibowitz. I remember the first time, it must have been 28, 29 years ago, when I started wanting to read all the Hugo novels, and I'd go through the list, and I read the title, A Canticle for Leibowitz. I was taken just by the title. I just couldn't wait until I found this book somewhere eventually, and was able to read it. But it just stayed with me. From the very first time I read the Canticle for Leibowitz, the title, through to the reading, the experience, which I just never let me down. And even now, I think this is my third or fourth reading. It just wonderful reading experience every single time I read through it. And it's been a good thing, 10 years since I last read Canticle for Leibowitz, to be fair, when it comes to my reading memory test. But I could remember this almost word for word, right? It's just a wonderful novel that it just holds a dear and special place in my heart. So look, when it comes to recommendations, I can't recommend this one enough. It is and has been one of my favorite books of all time. I'd have to say it's probably my top 5, which may not necessarily reflect itself on the board, but we'll take a look at that in a minute. So if you like your religious themed science fiction novels, then I highly recommend A Canticle for Leibowitz. I don't think you'll be disappointed. And I think if you like novels like Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, I'm currently reading through this one as well. And I'll find a lot of similarities between this, at least in the first part, as I did in A Canticle for Leibowitz. So if you've enjoyed Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light, I think you will enjoy A Canticle for Leibowitz, as well as A Case of Conscience by James Blish. Again, different novel, very much so a different novel, but explores similar kind of themes that I really enjoyed as well. So I'd say if you're a fan of A Case of Conscience by James Blish, you will enjoy A Canticle for Leibowitz. The other novel that comes to mind, which I don't have at hand at the moment, is George R. Stewart's Earth Abides. That is also a post-apocalyptic novel, and if you've enjoyed that, I'd say you will enjoy A Canticle for Leibowitz as well. We've got to rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder. I wonder if my personal biases are going to be reflected on the board. Let me set up and we'll take a look at it just now. So back to the share ladder and ranking tonight's 1961 Hugo Award-winning novel, one of my all-time favourite novels, A Canticle for Leibowitz. So it'll be interesting to see when I add my criteria to see exactly where this one ranks, because I'm trying to be fair when it comes to ranking it on the board, and I've used the same weighted input selection criteria, and I look at things like the concept, how strong is the concept, the science fiction or fantasy themes. I look at how well it has been executed. I look at things like the characters, like the writing, like the plot, like the ending, and how memorable this novel was. I crunch some numbers and out comes a number, and hopefully it will allow us to see exactly where this one ranks. So I've done all of that, and I'm pleased to say that so far my criteria is holding true to my personal likes and dislikes. And it is going to be somewhere on the A side, most definitely. So how about we go on a little bit of a journey to see exactly where this one goes. Now, I'd like to start with A Case of Conscience. I did mention that this and A Case of Conscience are two of my favourite novels. And where would I rank Walter M Miller Jr.'s novel, above or below A Case of Conscience? And I'm going to have to say I'm going to rank it above A Case of Conscience, and mainly to do with the overall writing and the plot and the ending as well. I just enjoyed the overall novel much more, not much more, but significantly more than I did A Case of Conscience. To Your Scattered Bodies Go is also another one of my classic wonderful novels of all time, my personal top 5. But I'm going to again give it to A Canticle for Leibowitz. I just love the novel. I love the writing. That in this doom and gloom world, there's still reflections of hope. And, that knowledge and the significance of knowledge and the church's part to play in knowledge that I really thoroughly enjoyed. So I'm going to have to say it is going to be better than To Your Scattered Bodies Go. Now with the Doomsday Book, I really enjoyed that novel, but what makes it rank so highly are the characters in that novel. And I'd have to say that when I do my weighted input, the characters in A Canticle for Leibowitz are not as strong or as memorable or as loving as they were in the Doomsday Book. For example, the priest in the Doomsday Book was just a wonderful character that I remember his actions and deeds far more than I did any one of the characters in this novel, A Canticle. But I did like the writing more in A Canticle for Leibowitz. I thought the pacing was a little bit better. So I'm going to have to give it again to A Canticle for Leibowitz, which takes us to the top 5. And boy, oh boy, is this hard. But I'm going to say A Canticle for Leibowitz sits above Way Station. And that is a difficult thing for me to say because I absolutely love Way Station. But I think I enjoyed the novel overall a little bit more than I did Way Station. And I'm going to give it to Gateway, slight edge over the concepts. I thought some of the science fiction concepts that we find in Gateway are a little bit stronger than what we find in a Canticle for Leibowitz. So there you have it. A really difficult choice tonight. It was always going to be somewhere there or thereabouts. It's a difficult one. What would you say? Have you read A Canticle for Leibowitz? Do you agree, disagree? Do you think it deserves to be in the top 5? It is definitely one of my personal favorites. And this is where we sit tonight. And like I said in the past, I'd love to revisit this board in 10 years and see exactly what a couple of years will do to me. But that's where we're going to sit tonight. I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly if you agree or disagree with my comments here. And if you read the books, I really would love to hear your opinions on this one. But as always, I thank you for spending time with me in the shed.